my name is Ken Whitney. I chair the board for the First Tee of Metropolitan New York. And as probably most of you know who are joining us today, our programs in New York, and frankly, as well as the programs.
This meeting is being recorded and or transcribed. Since
early March. So in New York, despite being closed, our staff, who is still in place, and we're doing online programs with our participants, and we're continuing to do our tutoring and other things. But, in addition to working with our participants, a lot of our fundraising in New York is done through events, which, they kind of started in March and, started getting canceling in March, and who knows when we're going to be able to do that again. But, we wanted to find a way to stay in touch with our supporters. And in that connection, I couldn't be more pleased to have Jimmy Roberts join us on the call today. Now, Jimmy needs no introduction. He is a 13-time Emmy Award-winning broadcaster and writer known most recently for his work on NBC and Golf Channel as an essayist, interviewer, and studio host. Throughout the course of his career, including his time at ABC, Jimmy has covered the World Series, the NBA Finals, heavyweight championship bouts, the Super Bowl, and the Olympics, among other sporting events. And for us here in New York, and I know there are some people from joining us outside the New York area, he is also the featured back page columnist for the Metropolitan Golfer magazine, which is a wonderful magazine, and it's something I look forward to. So, Jimmy, thanks so much for joining us today.
Ken, it's my pleasure.
So we're here to talk about Jimmy's book, which was published, I think, in 2009 was the year, and it's called Breaking the Slump, How Great Players Survive Their Darkest Moments in Golf and What You Can Learn from Them. And I have to tell you, I read it over the weekend, and I highly recommend it, and I think you'll make up your own mind after you hear us talk a little bit about it today. But before I get to the book, I want to talk a little bit about you, Jimmy, and a couple things. So for you, your introduction to golf, you grew up in White Plains. You went to White Plains High School, Westchester County. How did you get introduced to golf growing up?
Well, my parents were both golfers. And first of all, let me just ask, can everybody hear me okay? Because I'm using one of these Bluetooth devices. I'm hoping this is coming across okay.
It sounds good.
I can hear you fine. Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, I grew up in Westchester County. My parents played golf, and, I got it mostly from my mom and dad, and I was never very good at the game, but I was always passionate about it, and I ended up, I think that really kind of, the bug bit me when I was in high school, and then in my early college years, I wrote for the local newspaper, and we had odd hours. You'd work in the evening, and then you'd work right through the night usually, and you'd get off of work, and the sun was rising, and we'd go out and we'd play golf at the public courses around here, and it was a lot of fun. And the game was hard; it always has been. But the thing that I remember was most appealing to me was being with my friends and how much fun it was to just spend a couple hours walking around a beautiful place and challenging myself to do something physical.
And you grew up playing what course in Westchester?
So when I was first learned to play the game, my parents were members of a club in Armonk, which was called Bel Air, and that became the Canyon Club, and I don't know what it is now. But I played there when I was younger, but most of my golf was played at the public courses in White Plains. I played a lot at Maplemore and Saxon Woods. Played a lot at Purchase, which has now become Arrowwood, but that was an 18-hole kind of a semi-private place that we used to go and play a lot at. And I caddied at Fenway Golf Club. I caddied at Westchester Hills and at Ridgeway, which is now closed down. So kind of in and around the game.
What was the loop back then? How much did you get paid for a bag?
Oh my goodness! I can't even remember. I want to say maybe $20.
Yeah, that's what I got paid, $20, and that was including a nice tip back then.
Yeah, definitely a nice tip.
So growing up, it sounds like in high school you actually worked for the school newspaper. I think you went to University of Maryland to focus on journalism. So you kind of had that in your blood early on. And I love reading biographies. Actually, the latest one I just read was Bob Iger's, which I thought was tremendous.
I worked with Bob.
Your past probably passed, but one of the things I like to ask people that have had a huge amount of success in their careers, like you have, in doing what you're doing, is there were probably a few people or a few moments during the course of your career that kind of made a huge change for you, and I just thought maybe it might be fun for you to talk about a few of those.
Well, I think there's an irony. I did go to the University of Maryland, and I was a high school lacrosse player, and I was a decent player. My junior year, we actually went to the county championships and lost narrowly to the county powerhouse. My senior year, the year that I was captain, we were horrible. I mean, just awful. I had a pretty good year, but it didn't really matter. And I got a couple of recruiting letters from the University of Maryland, which at the time was the defending national champion, and it just swelled my head. And I decided, that's where I wanted to go. I also had a girlfriend who went to American University, which was not unrelated. So, so I went to Maryland, and I wasn't promised a scholarship or anything like that. I was just given preferred walk-on status, I think. And anyway, as I said, I was in over my head, and I wasn't good enough to play on that team. They ended up going to the national championship game again. But I think that in terms of turning points, the one that I look back on now, and I've never really thought about this before, is that I think the biggest turning point was the day I got cut from the team at Maryland, because then I ended up becoming the broadcaster of that team on the radio, because I was, I loved the game and I was familiar with the team and everything. And that team went to the national championship again, and it was on ABC's Wide World of Sports. And I reached out to the people at ABC to try and see if I could volunteer somehow, knowing that lacrosse way back then was something they probably weren't all that familiar with. And I was not only familiar with the game, but the team that was one of the teams that was going to be playing. And I ended up getting a job with them. And that ultimately led to, that was ultimately 4 years later, that became my entree into the industry. And it was through my connection of having kind of, I guess, been cut from the Maryland lacrosse team in the first place. And from there, everything kind of just followed.
And so you went to work with ABC right out of college, and but weren't you working on more the writing side of it, not the broadcasting side initially?
Yes, I was. So the first 8 years that I worked, and first 8 years out of college, I worked on the other side of the camera. I started as what they call a gopher. You go for this, you go for that. And my first staff position was as a production assistant, which is the entry-level job, or it was in the industry back then. I got promoted to associate director, where I was responsible for supervising the videotape area and replays and doing a lot of editing. Then I became an associate producer, where I would do a lot of feature work. I worked with Jim McKay and Howard Cosell and Jim Lampley and Keith Jackson, kind of producing feature work. I did a little bit of studio producing. Then I went to work for ABC News for a couple of years, because at the time, the president of ABC News was the same man who was the president of ABC Sports, Roone Arledge. And he wanted to put together a unit, kind of a hybrid unit, which could serve the interests of both divisions. There was a feeling that the news division needed some kind of embedded personnel who had more of a sports expertise, because you may or may not, nobody would necessarily remember. I haven't given a time frame here, but it was a time when there were a growing number of stories, sports stories, that were finding their way into the pages of newspapers, the front pages of newspapers, and they were really more than sports stories. You know, the death of Len Bias from a cocaine overdose, labor strife in the various professional leagues. And the news divisions found themselves reporting on things that they didn't really have people in their organization who could help them navigate those stories. On the other side of the coin, there was a feeling that when sports wanted to reach out and try and do things either very quickly or in places where they didn't have logistics, they didn't have technical support in place, the news division could be very helpful to them because they were much more nimble, and sports was just kind of like moved a little bit more ponderously. So the point was that they created an outfit that basically served the common interests of both divisions, and they took two people from the news division and two people from the sports division, and I, at the time, had been working for Howard Cosell, writing on his sports journalism show for him and producing features. So I was plucked from there to work in this hybrid unit for 2 years, and it was one of the great and influential experiences in my life because I learned a whole different way of doing things, and I learned and met a lot of people who I really admired. And I learned a whole new way of doing things and kind of ended up with kind of creating my own little hybrid way of doing things, which I think ultimately served me very well. But then, anyway, eventually I came back to the to the sports division, and Capital Cities at the time had purchased ABC. And while I wasn't concerned that I wasn't doing a good job at the time, when there was a corporate takeover, I think that they were looking for redundancies and they were looking for positions that they could cut. And there was a feeling that my job might be eliminated. So I had to kind of do a little bit of a reflection and acknowledge to myself what was the thing that I did best. And I figured, I was writing and producing these feature stories for people, and I could probably do it for myself. So I took a bunch of stories that I had done for people in the news and sports division, stories that I had written. I took their voice off, put my voice on. I recorded a couple of on-camera, as we call them, stand-ups, made a resume tape, sent it out, and got a bunch of nasty rejection letters. And the only nibble I got was from a very small cable outfit in rural Connecticut called the ESPN. And at the time, that was truly what cable was about. And I use cable as an adjective, not a noun. And I was just lucky to be there at a time when ESPN really exploded. And I'm probably even luckier, Ken, that I was there before YouTube, because some of the mistakes that I made my first few years on television, I'm just glad that they don't live anywhere. I'd probably be doing something else for a living right now if they were out there.
Is there any you want to talk about?
Oh my goodness! I think the worst one that we kind of joke about now in my family, and it's funny. My son is 23 years old, and he's now a sportscaster, despite all my urgings that he try and find an honest way to earn a living. He's now a sportscaster, and he sometimes stresses out about, if he's doing a good job. And I tell him my disaster story, the worst one that I had was, I think this was about 1990, and I had argued that I wanted to try and get some experience in the studio. And, I didn't really have very much experience as a broadcaster. So I did a show which couldn't have been any simpler. It was called This Week in Sports. It was a 30-minute show that used to air on ESPN on Sunday mornings, and most all of it was on tape, and all you needed to do was introduce a couple of tape stories. And the problem was that as new as I was, the person who was producing the show was even newer. And when the timings went a little bit off the rails and they had to make some adjustments, she really didn't handle it terribly well. And to make matters worse, I didn't handle it well. And to make matters even worse, we had some technical difficulties. And if things could have been any more horrific, it just happened to be during a period of time when a writer for a national newspaper, there was a newspaper that was around for a little while called The National, and their TV critic was a guy named Norman Chad, who coincidentally happened to have gone to the University of Maryland also, but he was watching 24 hours of ESPN. And I ended up becoming the lead in the story, and I think what he said about me was, if you saw the movie Broadcast News, the part of Albert Brooks was played for real by Jimmy Roberts yesterday on television. And it was just a crushing, horrible experience, but I survived it, and luckily now I can laugh at it.
Well, that it gets to some of the quotes in your book, which we'll talk about. But, getting to the book, this was 18 different stories about these incredible players who all went through slumps that all of us golfers know well. And just very quickly, the 18 players were Paul Azinger, Jack Nicklaus, Scott Verplank, David Duval, Dan Jansen, Justin Rose, Greg Norman, Phil Mickelson, Ben Crenshaw, Johnny Miller, Davis Love, Justin Leonard, George H.W. Bush, Arnold Palmer, Dottie Pepper, Tom Watson, Steve Stricker, and Hal Sutton. And so my question for you is, what drove you to write the book in the first place, number one? And number two, when you decided you were going to write the book, did you know which players you were going to write about, or did you have some in mind and then you figured out others? How did that process play out?
There was the genesis of the book was that I had always wanted to challenge myself. I don't know how many of the folks out there listening have written a book or tried to write a book. I mean, it's a hard thing to do. And I forget who it was. There's a famous quote. It might be George Bernard Shaw or somebody who said, when they asked him if he likes writing, he says, "I don't like writing, I like having written." The process, I actually like writing very much, but it's really just an unbelievable challenge. It's weighty. I worked for Dick Schaap for a number of years, and Dick wrote, I think, like 30-something books. And I worked with him during times when he was writing, and he was a madman. Just really, really kind of a little bit undone. And I remember he told me once, he says, if you're ever going to write a book, he says, you need to make sure that you find something to write about that you really, really are interested in or really care about. Because if you don't, it'll be a miserable experience. It's just such an all-consuming thing. And part of it was, I think, that I wanted to see if I could do it. People had always said, "Oh, you're a good writer." And I thought, well, writers write books, I think I had been writing that Met Golfer column at that time, and doing a lot of writing for TV, and I had written for a newspaper chain. But I thought, like a real writer writes a book. Anyway, I had a friend who was a literary agent, and he had always said, "Yeah, you should write a book. You should write a book." And it just came to me as like an epiphany. I remember exactly where I was. I was in the parking lot of a Best Buy store on Central Avenue in Yonkers. It was a terrible rainy day, and for some reason, I seemed to be thinking about what could I write about, And at the time, I was really upset about how terribly I was playing golf. And it just kind of came to me. It's like, well, everybody who plays golf, suffers through what I'm suffering through, don't they? And I thought about it for 5 minutes. I picked up the phone. I called this guy, and he thought, I think that sounds like a great idea. And so to answer your question, the other part of your question, I didn't know exactly who I was going to write about, but I figured it was Universal. And I was fortunate enough, I had to put together a pitch for the book, and which was, again, something new to me. And this agent said to me that what you need to do is in essence, you need to write a sample chapter, and then you need to kind of lay out what the rest of the book will look like and who some of the people might be. And that was a bunch of work. But since I decided that it was something that really afflicted everybody, I went to Arnold Palmer, who I always had a really good relationship with. And I told him my idea, and I said I needed to write a sample chapter. And I asked him, I said, do you think you'd spend some time with me so I could write this chapter? And, typical anybody out there who ever knew Arnold, he was, yeah, sure, of course, Jimmy, no problem, let's talk. And he spent some time with me. I wrote the sample chapter about him, which became the chapter in the book. And then I just put on my thinking cap, and I realized through what I did for a living, I had a lot of acquaintances or professional friendships that I could kind of lean on. And so I did. And it was
so the answer is you didn't have any of them in mind when you decided to write the book. You had to then, you did Arnold Paul. I mean, you may have had him in your mind, but you hadn't had the discussions that you have in the book. You hadn't had any of those yet.
No, none. But it really wasn't a terrible thing, because one of the things I found out was that, at that time I was doing the interviewing for our broadcast. I was doing it exclusively. And, I had spent a lot of time asking people questions that they didn't want to hear. But the thing about slumps, when you talk to people who've had, athletes who've come through adversity, that's actually something they might not want to talk to you about it while it's happening. But after it's already happened and they've kind of come through it, I find that people love to talk about it because they found a solution, and they can look back. And it's just like I can easily look back on that horrible studio experience I had. I think that golfers, when they figure stuff out, or professional athletes, they are happy to talk about these things because they feel good about having had the fortitude and the strength and the perseverance to find a solution. So I got great stories. There's a lot of memorable stuff in there. I mean, Justin Leonard, who's now a colleague of mine, but back then Justin could be a little standoffish, but he was more than happy to talk about how he was in such a slump he had to pull off to the side of the road after the Honda Classic one year. He's in a parking lot on the phone with his wife, sobbing hysterically because he just doesn't think he can play golf anymore. And this was a kid who won, he won the U.S. Amateur, he won the NCAA championship. He was one of only a handful of people who qualified to play on the PGA Tour without having to go to Q school. I mean, he was it. But there were a lot of people like that. Scott Verplank, for me, was my favorite chapter in the book because of what he went through. It was really, I love talking to people. My wife says that I don't have conversations with people. I interview them. It was really interesting to hear people talk about their times.
Well, to me, the two words that came up constantly in the book, which you might expect, is confidence, or lack thereof, and perseverance, which just happen to be, two of the 9 core values of First Tee. So I wanted to ask you, thinking of those two words and the 18 stories, which one best apply to some of those stories that you wrote about?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. My favorite quote from the book, I'll give you 2 quotes from the book that apply to those 2 words. Confidence was what Paul Azinger said. He said that confidence is the strangest thing. When you've got it, you don't think there's any way you could ever lose it. And once you've lost it, you don't think there's any way you could ever get it back. And I think the point is that it's elusive. You know, it just doesn't feel like something you can hold. And in terms of perseverance, the thing that I think of is my former colleague, Johnny Miller. And he says that a person shouldn't be judged by what they've accomplished. A person should be judged by what they've overcome. And, you know, I learned a lot, you know, for myself. It was really an exercise in self-discovery, too. And I think back on that book, and I think that I started to write a golf book, but I ended up writing a book about how successful people handle adversity. And so it was useful in so many ways.
Yeah, you know, I thought the most, and by the way, I thought of the 18 stories in there, the two most interesting to me, which is ironic, they both happen to be announcers today, were Azinger and Miller. But the one that was kind of amazing about Miller was, you know, Miller, a little bit like Justin Leonard, had this incredible career coming up. He, you know, won everything pretty much, and then he kind of didn't like going out on the tour anymore. He wanted to be at home. He was having a growing family, and he decided he had to go back out because he had never really faced adversity in his life. And, you know, how could he quit at that point, having never done that? And what message would that send to his kids? I think that's the way I read it in the book.
Yeah. Listen, everybody takes from this something different, but, you know, Johnny, anybody who knows Johnny or has ever known him, he is, you know, an English teacher or a sports editor would absolutely cringe to hear me use this phrase, but we use it all the time. Johnny is very unique. Somebody can't be very unique. You're either unique or you're not. But if anybody qualifies at being very unique, it's Johnny Miller. You know, the way he thinks about things, the way he processes, you know, it's one of the reasons why, love him or hate him, I mean, he was a really, really good television announcer. He was very honest. He worked hard, but he thought about things differently, you know, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why he was such a good golfer. I think people who are really good at anything are just different, you know, and I think that Johnny's one of the more memorable people I've ever worked with.
Yeah. And the thing I liked about the Azinger story was, as you say in the book, or as he said in the book, he said in high school he couldn't have 2 days in a row where he broke 80.
Yeah.
And he wasn't recruited at all or anything like that. He went to some small school, and in the summer of his freshman year, he gets a job working over at Bay Hill.
That's right.
And so that whole summer he's playing Bay Hill, which for people who haven't played that course, it is, particularly if you go back, it is a really difficult golf course with all the water and everything else. And playing the course that summer transformed his game, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he became the real outlier. Now, that doesn't really happen, you know, that people get that good that late. And he had a weird grip, you know, incredibly strong, and people told him that he would never be any good with that grip. You know, and sometimes the answer is, you know, to just have faith in the way you're doing things and just work harder at it. You know, we were talking about quotes. I have to tell you, because I might forget it, and I often think back on this quote. It's one of my favorites. Davis Love, you know, for people who don't remember or don't know, Davis's father, who passed away in a tragic plane accident, Davis's father was a great instructor, and he, Davis Jr., so Davis III's father, played his college golf at the University of Texas for Harvey Penick. And Harvey, of course, was the author of the Little Red Book, which, if I'm not mistaken, John Feinstein probably wouldn't be happy about this, but I think the Little Red Book is the greatest selling sports book of all time. And if you haven't read it, it's really amazing. It's a golf book that's not about golf. It just talks about, you know, kind of some homespun wisdom of, you know, the way you think, the way you go about your business. And that's basically the way Harvey taught golf. And Harvey, of course, taught Ben Crenshaw and Tom Kite. And as I said, he was the coach at the University of Texas. And Davis Jr. was playing at the University of Texas for him. And one day, Davis is out on the range, and he's hitting balls, and Harvey walks by. And Harvey says to him, Davis, what club are you hitting there? And he says, well, Coach, I'm hitting this 7-iron. And Davis was hitting at a green 150 yards away. He says, it's a 7-iron, Coach. He says, Davis, I need you to get me some 5-irons on that green. He said, Coach, that green's 150 yards away. I might even be able to get 8-iron there. He says, yeah, Davis, I need you to get some 5-irons on that green. And he just walked away. And if I remember the story correctly, later on, Davis came up to him and said, Coach, why did you need me to hit 5-iron there? That was way too much club. He says, well, you know what, Davis? Because sometimes the answer is to try less hard. And if that isn't ever a prescription for solving so many of the problems that so many of us have in life, where it applies to so many different things, I mean, could we all not just grip the steering wheel a little bit less tightly? You know, I mean, what wouldn't we do better if we didn't let our foot off the gas just a little bit? So, I mean, I think I just was fortunate enough to stumble on a bunch of the right people. And these are things, I mean, I wrote that book, 11 years ago now, and these are things that I can still remember, you know, vividly. So, and I hope I put them to use when I come to times of my own challenge.
Well, as you know, at the first tee, you know, our objective is to teach life skills to youth, you know, using the game of golf. And in that connection, I thought one of the best quotes in the book was from Greg Norman. I don't know if you remember it, but I'm sure you do. You know, show me a path with no obstacles, and that path will lead you nowhere.
That's right.
And I just thought that was a great quote. And you know, the other interesting thing that I learned that, you know, we all remember what happened to him in the Masters with Faldo, but, you know, kind of what he did after that kind of earned him a lot of friends, right?
Well, you know, I'm not sure exactly what you're talking about there. But
well, when he instead of sort of rushing off, he went in and did the interview room for an hour and a half or whatever it was.
Yeah. No, I remember what you're talking about now. Yeah, listen, Greg was a polarizing figure. I think a lot of people resented him because of how talented he was. A lot of people were jealous of him. You know, he had the whole package. And, you know, he'd be the first to tell you he could be arrogant. But, you know, he handled that defeat magnificently. And you're not going to succeed, I mean, for the benefit of the kids who might be hearing this, you know, life is not filled with only success, you know, and you got to learn how to deal with not only the challenges but the failures. And, you know, it's not about getting knocked down. It's about getting up. So, listen, I got 3 kids of my own, and, you know, we talk about stuff like this all the time. And, you know, I still try and remember this stuff myself all the time. You know, golf teaches a lot of lessons. George Bush talked a lot about that in the chapter. I was, you know, one of the great blessings of my life in terms of people that I've had the good fortune of having met and gotten to know was, you know, President Bush. 41, I met him in 1997. I was working for ESPN. The U.S. Open that year was at Congressional, and I wanted to do a story on the history of presidential golf because so many presidents had played golf at Congressional in Washington. And so I reached out to his office asking if I could perhaps have him answer some questions. He was a former president at the time. And what I got back was a phone call from his office asking if I would be interested in coming up to play golf with him at Cape Arundel and doing the interview up there. And that was a true pinch-me moment. I wasn't expecting that. But, you know, went up. He couldn't have been any nicer. I mean, I don't have very much sports memorabilia in my house, but I'm looking right now at the one piece that I do have in my office. which is a memory of that day. Somebody took a picture of the president and I on the golf course together, and we looked like just two guys trying to figure something out. I have my scorecard from that day, which at the time I shot my best score at that time ever, and he signed it. I have the dollar bill that he insisted that we play for, which he then signed, and I have the note that he sent me on his personal stationery thanking me for the day. They're all together in a little collage. But he was a remarkable, remarkable man in so many ways, regardless of your politics. He was just an amazing man, what he accomplished in public life, but personally, the way he dealt with people. And my recollection of the chapter that he and I did together was how he talked about how golf exposes your character. And that's what golf was about to him. And this is a man whose, father and grandfather were presidents of the United States Golf Association. Golf was part of his life, his entire life. So it was...
Well, you remember Mark McCormick's book, What They Can't Teach You at Harvard Business School. And he had a chapter in there about how you want to truly find out about someone, just play around a golf with them. And you'll learn everything you need to know about them.
Right.
But getting back to your book, one other comment I'd say is that what was interesting to me is that there were sort of a couple of takeaways that were in each of the stories that were similar. And that is, at the end of the day, when people were struggling, it generally came down to kind of one of three things: your grip, your setup, and rhythm. I think the whole thing with Palmer was that his big issue was he would tend to get quick. And I was going to have you tell the Davis Love Harvey Pennock story, which you've already done. But those were sort of the three things that came out to me.
Yeah, well, I think basically what you're talking about is fundamentals. And, some guys, they talked about fundamentals and how important they are. And again, go back to anything you do in your life. There are fundamentals to everything you do in your life. It's not only about, your grip, your stance, your setup. In golf, how do you go about your job? Are you prepared? Are you organized? How do you treat people? Are you kind? These are the fundamentals of life, and they bear on so much of what we do. So, and maybe I'm reaching, but that's the way I tend to read it.
No, I totally agree with you. So, listen, I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book this weekend. It's a fun read. Like I said, it's like reading 18, different biographies, and you learn a lot. I mean, Nicholas, although I'm not sure if I'm remembering this right, but the first slump he sort of had in his career was 1979, where he didn't win a tournament that year, and he gave it up for 4 months. And then at the beginning of the year, started working with the teacher, and he changed his swing. You might want to talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, and then he went out and won 2 major championships the next year. But he just, he put his clubs away in the garage. And what you got to remember too is that Jack was a very family-oriented man, and when you're the best in the world, the only person you probably have to prove anything to is yourself. But I think at the time he was working with, I think Jack Rout was still alive, and he was working with him, and he said he went right back to the beginning, and he wanted him to teach him as if he was a beginner golfer, and he did. Jack's kind of a remarkable guy. Anybody who's the best ever at anything bears some examination. Bears, I guess that's play on words there. I didn't mean that. Bad pun. But I've had Jack's an interesting guy. He went back, and I think that he's the perfect example of somebody who, if somebody's never going to have a slump, it's going to be Jack Nicklaus. And by the way, I reached out to Tiger, and I thought at the time, now this was pre all the terrible stuff that happened to him, but he didn't want to participate because he said he had been obligated to work with a publisher on some books of his own. But he would have been an interesting person to talk to about that.
Although at that point, he probably didn't have much of a huge slump, right? I mean, back in '08 or I guess when you were working on this?
No, but the reason was, Tiger and I actually had some history going back to 2000. People may or may not remember it. Part of the problem with Tiger is that when you accomplish so much and you set a standard like that, anytime you are not reaching that standard, people are going to ask you what's wrong. And so there was a period of time when he was, and I think this would have been in the spring of 2001, where he had gone a period of time without winning. And I don't know if it was unprecedented in terms of the number of tournaments he played without winning, or if he was just struggling in a couple of tournaments. But the chatter was back then that he was in a slump. And that made him crazy, that anybody would have suggested that he was in a slump. And I remember on a broadcast on NBC, I said that it was my opinion that Tiger was in a slump the same way that, the Beatles were in a slump any week in 1964 that they didn't have a #1 record. And I think at that point that the tongue-in-cheek nature of that comment went right over his head, and he got very angry at me. So he then went on a rip. I think he won, if I recall this correctly, he won Bay Hill, he won the Players, and he won the Masters. And that was his answer to people about being in a slump. And he had such contempt for, I remember I did an interview with him after he won the Players that year, and he actually walked out of the interview, and it was a Monday finish, and he said, nice slump, huh, Jimmy? And by the way, all these years later,
was that on TV or was that written about afterwards?
No, it was on TV.
It was on TV, yeah.
Yeah, and all these years later, anytime my kids want to give me a hard time, they'll say, in my house, they say, nice slump, Jimmy.
So we just talked about Tiger and Jack, so we've got a couple of questions here. So where do you come out on the Tiger-Jack question?
Jack's the greatest player of all time. He's won 18 major championships. And I think that's the standard. I think that if you want to call them 1 and 1A, that's fine. My opinion always had been that he would break Sam Snead's record. Now he's tied with Snead. And my opinion always had been that he won't break Jack's record. And I don't think he will. I mean, in order to break Jack's record, he has to win 4 more major championships. Which, think about it. Win 4 major championships and you're in the Hall of Fame. He's going to approach...
The other side of that would be, how many years in the prime of his career? What was it, an 8-year stretch? Or I guess it was, 2008 to 2013 when he won again. So he kind of went 5 years in the middle of his career, between his injuries and everything else, not doing anything.
Where he struggled, right? But listen, that's golf, Nobody owns it, you rent it, no matter who you are. And, Tiger had his slump. And that's the way it goes. Listen, I often said this when I remember when I was touring around talking about this book. We're all the same. So we all have slumps. It's just a matter of degree. When Jack Nicklaus would struggle, he would lose the ball to the left. When I would struggle, I would lose the ball. It's just a matter of degree,
Well, the one question we got from several people is that when Tiger did try to come back, I think we all remember kind of his, I don't know if it was chipping yips or whatever. At Alworth, where he was hitting those fat chips on the par 5 on the back 9, or Arizona, where he was sculling things over the green.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any insight to, was that mental? Was that physical? What was that? Because when you saw that, and now you see him chip today and the way he's playing today. It's like, how can this be the same person, you know?
Listen, he's been through a lot, physically, emotionally, mentally. And I don't know how you can do anything but admire what he's come back from. You know, you can be your own judge about the way you feel about what his life has been like. But I think it's indisputable that the depths from which he came back they're remarkable. Public humiliation, physically compromised, a game which had fallen apart in many ways, but, you detail with the chipping. I can't tell you firsthand about some of that stuff because he's not really always been the most forthright person in talking about some of his struggles. And he doesn't really like the media, and he never has. I think he's learned to tolerate it. I think he's gotten a lot better. But I think one of the most telling quotes that I ever heard from him was when Jaime Diaz went to interview him when he was very, very young, 13 years old or maybe younger, and he asked him, why do you guys need to know all this stuff? So that's always been his attitude, and I don't think he's looked at things like, I don't think he's looked at it as kind of a deal, that you trade becoming a public personality, or you have to become somewhat of a public personality in order to reap the rewards that, this aspect of being a public personality offers. I think, like I said, he's grown a lot more comfortable with it. Like any situation, I'm sure there are people that he gets along with better than others. We all do. There are people he trusts more than others. But, I'm guessing that if you had to make a list of, the things that Tiger enjoys doing, talking to the media would be well down on that list.
Yeah. What do you think the tour looks like after Tiger? I mean, do you someone who covers the game, I mean, it'll certainly be different. Do you think the tour worries about that?
Look, he's Haley's Comet. People who never saw him play need to understand this isn't once in a lifetime. This is once in several lifetimes that you see something like this. His winning percentage was greater than Jack's. So, there were periods that, there were years, if you look back in the record books, where, he's winning 6, 7, 8, times